Hey, it's Daryl. Team Common is currently working on our transition to a weekly show. We'll be back this summer with new episodes. In the meantime, here's one from our archives.
WBUR Podcasts, Boston.
I'm Daryl C. Murphy, and you're listening to The Common. So, Cristela Guerra, you are a WBUR arts and culture reporter.
I am, yeah.
But this story here that we're about to talk about is very heavy on the culture.
It is.
And I mean heavy, because we're talking about the experience of Venezuelan migrants and the people who support them as they try to get settled in America. Now, I want to be clear here. I know that earlier this year, there was a plane that arrived on Martha's Vineyard, and there were about 50 Venezuelan migrants aboard. And, there was a whole hubbub about it. It was a political stunt, basically. We're not talking about that, but we are talking about the experience of Venezuelan migrants in general, and those stories that don't get the coverage. So, Cristela, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, my pleasure, Daryl.
What exactly made you want to do this story? Why focus on Venezuelan migrants specifically?
I'd want to say that it had nothing to do with that plane of people, but it did in a way, because I remember when it happened, a lot of, Latino leaders, a lot of activists, and a lot of people in the Venezuelan community locally were sort of aghast. But then beyond that, like the bigger community of immigrants was also a bit of aghast, because there's a quote in the piece I'm doing now. It felt like people were treated like cargo. And as a result of that situation, suddenly the whole world seemingly knew about people walking up Central America from Venezuela. When it all sort of happened, I wanted to understand how it felt to find home again.
Yeah.
Which is a bit ironic considering my family migrated, right? We just did it in a different way. I'm an immigrant from Panama, and so I could relate to that. But at the same time, I didn't, take buses and walk, up 9 countries. So it's a very different situation. It's a very specific, nuanced migration for all kinds of reasons. And I wanted to really meet the people who were coming.
Take us through the story, right? You introduce us to a woman named Isabel Rodriguez. Tell us about Isabel and her family.
So Isabel came 5 years ago with her daughter and her mother for their own reasons, seeking political asylum, fleeing Venezuela. And Isabel's kind of has a good sense of what it is now to live in the United States. It took her 5 years, but she has a pretty good grasp of it.
Yeah.
But I would say about a week after the situation happened on the Vineyard, Isabel heard from family members she didn't know were coming. And she suddenly had her own unexpected guests call her asking if she could help them get coats because they were cold in New York City, where a lot of migrants who are bussed up from the border end up. They end up in New York, they end up in D.C. or Chicago.
Yeah.
And Isabel sort of took them one better, essentially. She said, you know what? Let me come get you. And this is that story of them landing in her home, in this 3-bedroom house, now living 11, 12 people.
And Isabel's in Massachusetts?
She is. She's just outside of Worcester.
Gotcha. And what was the journey like for the family that came up here?
Very, very difficult. They traveled in a much larger group that now is seemingly dispersed around the United States. And they ventured through jungle in parts of Panama called the Darien Gap. A lot of people told me just in the process of reporting on this that migration seems like a bit of a business right now in Central America, where people are conned, right? Or, told, give us your money or you're not getting on this next bus. And the difference between that and walking is big when you're trying to get from like Costa Rica or Guatemala to the U.S.-Mexico border, So like people, by the time they get to the border, don't really have much money. And they just kept saying how lucky they felt, how blessed they were to actually have survived it at all.
To travel on foot, through the conditions that you described, makes me wonder, what exactly is it that they're leaving? What are they migrating from?
Varied circumstances. It really depends. I think any advocate or any people who deal specifically with immigrants would tell you that every story is completely distinct, although the larger picture and the larger portrayal of the circumstances in Venezuela are pretty, it's a regime. It's a dictatorship.
Yeah.
And in many cases, people are fleeing because they were protesting the government and then found their lives were in danger. What you'll hear from Venezuelans frequently is like, we weren't immigrants. People would immigrate to us. We had opportunities to offer countries that had less than we did. And now we're the ones leaving. And they seem almost a bit stunned. There's a lot of trauma for them leaving home.
With that, tell me how the story of Venezuelan migrants, how do they differ from other migrant stories?
What I found, and I guess I should preface for people listening, I was at the border. I went down with the attorneys for the 50 that were dropped off on the Vineyard because the lawyers first and foremost wanted to understand the conditions under which they entered. And so I wrote a piece from El Paso where I was looking at that part, the part you're asking me about, the journey to the U.S.
Yeah.
And then the aftermath of that, whether they end up in Dallas, Utah, Chicago. What does life look like once you're in this new country and you're trying to adapt? So the second piece, which is coming out soon, is focused on that. It's focused on this idea of building home. And so for a lot of Venezuelan migrants, at least from what I'm hearing from people who do this work, it's different because they don't have many people here. Other groups have come into boroughs or communities that were already sort of had been here for a few decades, a few years. They had businesses established, they had homes. But because this migration is building, because people have been coming for a while, although for the greater country, the face of this is those 50, there are so many people who've been coming now for a year and a half or more. And those who know tend to be the very small niche associations, like the Venezuelan Association of Massachusetts, who was the organization that I traveled with over November. I connected with them to visit different homes where migrants were staying in the state of Massachusetts or in the Commonwealth. And that's how I did the second story. The second story was about building home. And what does life look like after you cross? How do you navigate your trauma? Who helps you? It was very much a focus of who are the helpers now? And for some people, they were found living on the street. For some people, they were found living in shelters. Eventually, somehow, they connected with this association and they're getting coats. They're getting hygienic products. They're getting things that they need to be able to adjust accordingly. Legal help. It's really incredible to see how much assistance is being offered by an organization that in some cases is paying out of its own pocket.
We're going to take a quick break, but we'll be right back with more from Cristela.
Politics has never been stranger or more online, which is why the politics team at Wired is making a new show, Wired Politics Lab. It's all about how to navigate the endless stream of news and information and what to look out for. Each week on the show, we'll dig into far-right platforms, AI chatbots, influencer campaigns, and so much more. Wired Politics Lab launches Thursday, April 11th. Follow the show wherever you get your podcasts.
And we're back. So the sense that I'm getting from you is that for the folks who immigrated from Venezuela, their place, their community is still developing for them here.
Yeah, it's growing, and it's growing with a different population that, perhaps those who came before could afford it. A lot of the folks coming lack the resources to make this new life. And so then it sort of speaks to the idea of I think the question of why did they leave? Each person will tell you a different story, but each situation I think was dire enough for them to feel like they should come. And in many cases, they want to come to help those who are still there. So a lot of folks here who came previously perhaps had different circumstances. They had different resources. But the class issue in this is also sort of something to talk about. The president of the Venezuelan Association of Massachusetts, Denise Rincon, who was very much my guide and who knows the whole community, it feels like, would tell you that what matters here is that people need help. And so regardless of who they are, There's rhetoric around who are these people or whatever. But ultimately, what she cares about is these are her fellow countrymen, and she feels led to assist them. And in turn, once then they establish themselves, they will assist those who come after. So that's the heart of my story, is that question of like, you can't make it without those who came before you.
Mm-hmm. Now, to that point, you know, if I'm a listener and I'm listening to this discussion that we're having and I'm feeling moved, what can I do? Who can I call? Who do I donate to? What are my options?
You know what's really interesting? In some ways, like what came out of that situation on the Vineyard was that need, that inclination. But those people had so much help.
Right.
And so I think then people started reaching out to the Venezuelan Association of Massachusetts, to other associations in New York and DC, to shelters. You know, Salem State right now is opening up some vacant residence halls specifically for transitional housing to help unhouse people and migrant families. And so it's sort of something I think that we're seeing a response both from the state and the city, because advocates are seeing a need, especially in the wintertime. So there's a lot of coat drives happening. There's a lot of clothing drives, things like that. There's opportunities out there. You just have to seek out the proper organizations.
Gotcha. So this is a two-part story. One where you look at a situation here in the area, and another where you actually went down to El Paso. Can you give us a piece that did not make it into the story? What is something that did not make it in that you wish you could add?
Oh, man. When I was in El Paso the last day, I attended an event that's been happening down there for years called Hugs Not Walls, where because of, I think, the relationship between this specific nonprofit that holds this and the local border patrol, they have, it's like this makeshift platform that they literally build that morning. So imagine Saturday morning, it's like 6 a.m. You have 200 families in yellow shirts in El Paso. And the border is right there. And on the other side of the border are 200 some odd families in blue shirts. And every year, once a year, they bring these families together because I don't know if people realize El Paso and Juarez are a hop, skip, and a jump away. It's literally, I can't even remember the amount, but it's like 300 feet. They'll build the platform on the river, which is very dry. So it's essentially a riverbank. The Border Patrol opens the gates on the U.S. side. People set up for the day, and they, one by one, go down into the riverbank and they hug. And it takes a lot of coordinating. It takes a lot of technicalities. It takes a lot of finagling to get these families to make sure they're in line properly, family number, whatever. So then the family on the U.S. side and the family on the Mexico side get together. They go into the riverbank on this platform that was built that day, and they're given 5 minutes to hug. And then the most heartbreaking moment is when they say time.
Ugh. My heart is breaking. Oh, my God.
It goes all day, Daryl. We were there from 6 until 10, and then we were going into Juarez. But, I don't know if people realize life on the border. A lot of people cross into Mexico for lunch because their families are there. People who grow up there grow up crossing, daily. It's very common. And they watch people who go to the port of entry and they surrender themselves to try and enter and seek asylum in the United States. That is a human right. They're allowed to do that.
Yeah.
So that event was one that, because everything else was going on, because the story centered around people from Venezuela in Juarez trying to get into the United States, I went to that event, but I didn't get a chance to cover it like I planned to.
Cristela, this is incredible. Thank you so much for sharing it with us. For real. This is an amazing story.
Thank you for having me all.
That's WBUR arts and culture reporter Cristela Guerra. Thanks for listening. I'm Daryl C. Murphy. Talk to you later.